You're watching the Wise Channel. Da, 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 da. Today we're going to talk about I, which is based on imaginary numbers, but we're taking I to a power. What? Let's talk about it. First of all, let me ask you this. Could you recall, what is square root of 7 times square root of 7? Would you agree that that would be square root of 49? And what's the square root of 49? 7. So do you agree that square root of 7 times square root of 7 equals 7? Okay? I want you to hold on to that in your head, because we're going to use that concept in just a little bit. Square root of negative 5 times square root of negative 5 is positive 25, right? Well, hold on to that thought too. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay? So, now, let me ask you a question. What is the square root of negative 1? In fact, before I even go there, what would be the square root of negative 25? Is that even possible? 5 times 5 is positive 25. Negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25, right? Is there such a thing as the square root of a negative number? No, it doesn't exist. So we call it imaginary, all right? And what we do is we use the letter I. So for example, square root of negative 1 is 1i, and we just call it I. Okay? So square root of negative 1 is I. That being said, square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1. Now, here's where it gets a little dicey, because we talked about negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25. But when you're taking the square root of a negative times the square root of a negative, remember how we said square root of 7 times square root of 7 is 7? Well, square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1 is negative 1. You would think it would be positive 1. I know, but for some reason it's negative 1. So the square root of negative 1 times negative 1 is negative 1, which is I squared. This is I, so I times I is I squared, and I squared is negative 1. Okay?
Wait, how does
Go ahead.
positive I squared make a negative I? Negative 1. How does a negative 1 make a positive I?
Yes. So that's a good question. Why is positive I the square root of negative 1, but I squared is actually negative 1? I don't have a good answer for that. That is a very good question. And the best I can give you is roll with it. Meaning, this is one of those things that isn't really going to make sense. So I'm just going to ask you to kind of roll with it. It's just going to be out there. It's the way this works. When it's the square root of a negative, and we take square root of a negative times the square root of a negative, it's going to stay negative. And see, you can't think of the square root of a negative actually being positive. That's not what it is. We just simply call this some imaginary thing that doesn't exist. So this is the imaginary thing that doesn't exist to the second power. This is the imaginary thing that doesn't exist to the third power. So what we do is, this piece here that we called negative 1 now gets multiplied by what we once called I, right? this is -1, and this guy is I. So -1 times I is -1I, or more simply, -I, which is the same as I to the third. So I to the third is the same as -I. Okay? Now we take it one more step and we say, all right, this whole piece here that we called -I, we multiply times I. And you know what? I take it back. It's going to be easier if we do it like this. I'm sorry. I'm just going to take these two pieces here. These two pieces is -1. These two pieces are -1. And -1 times -1, now not in the square root, a negative times a negative is a positive, which is 1. And 1 is I to the 4th. What?
I've been saying in my head.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I to the 4th is 1. All right. So here's the whole thing that you need to know. The whole thing you need to know is that I to the 1st is I. Okay. I to the 2nd is -1. I to the 3rd is -I, and I to the 4th equals 1. And what happens is, it starts all over again once we go to I to the 5th. I to the 5th, okay, when you take 1 times I, you get I. I to the 6th then becomes -1. I to the 7th becomes -I, and I to the 8th equals 1. So it goes I, -1, -I, 1. I, -1, -I, 1. And it just keeps repeating every 4th exponent. Okay? For example, I to the 33rd power. All right, here's what we do. We take 33 and we divide it by 4. 4 goes into 33 how many times? 4 goes into 33 8 times. 8 times 4 is 32. Your remainder is 1. Since your remainder is 1, that means I to the 33rd power is the same as I to the 1st power. What's I to the 1st power? I.
So it's whatever your remainder number is.
It's whatever the remainder number is this. Okay? Over here, I to the 42. How many times does 4 go into 42? Oh, why did I use 4, by the way? Because it's 1, 2, 3, 4 that repeats every time. It's 4 repeating numbers every time. Okay?
Wait, so you always use 4?
Always. 4 goes into, when I'm giving you these problems, you always ask how many times does 4 go into the exponent. 4 goes into 42 10 times. 10 times 4 is 40. What's your remainder? 2. So this is the same as I to the 2nd power. What's I to the 2nd power? -1. So I to the 42nd is -1. How about I to the 55th power? How many times does 4 go into 55? 4 times, well, let's see this. 1 times 4 is 4. 4 times 3 is 12. Okay, and your remainder is 3. Meaning, it's the same as I to the third. What's I to the third? I to the third is negative I. That's your answer. Okay?
See, I get it when you do it this way.
Yeah.
Okay.
You do it a little that way.
That stuff over there is confusing. Okay, so all I need you to know is this. This is all, well, so what you need really, what you need is this. This is your reference guide here. Okay? And I'll always have this for you. Okay? So, but this is what you'll do for all of your problems today. You're just going to divide by 4, and what's the remainder, and then rewrite it using your reference guide. Okay? Now, how many times does 4 go into 60? Well, 4 goes into 60 15 times, and 15 times 4 is 60. Your remainder is 0. When you have a remainder of 0, 0 is the same as I to the 4th power. Okay? Because there's nothing after that. So I to the 4th is the same as 1. Okay? So when you have a remainder of 0, use that as I to the 4th. Okay? You've been watching the Weiss channel. Da 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 da.